Right, well, I'd like to introduce our last speaker before lunch, and that's Dr. Carl Soulsbury. Carl's senior lecturer at the School of Life Sciences at the University of Lincoln, where he teaches across a range of modules in ecology, evolutionary biology and conservation. Before moving to Lincoln, he had postdoctoral positions at the Universities of Jyväskylä in Finland and Bristol. Carl's main interest is in evolutionary life history strategies, and his work primarily focused on vertebrates, but he has similar work on invertebrates and plants. Following his undergrad time at the University of Aberdeen, Carl took a PhD at the University of Bristol on red fox dispersal, carried out further postdoctoral studies on red grouse behavioural ecology, and continues to work, black grouse behavioural ecology, and continues to work on black grouse as his main study system. Now, we've talked a bit today already about the sort of degree of regulatory control over wild animals, and recently the UK Home Office have significantly uprated their guidance on use of wildlife under the Animal Scientific Procedures Act. So I think this is a very topical area, and I'm very much looking forward to hear Carl's presentation. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everybody. I'm going to start with a little bit of fudge, sort of foodie theme. I'd like to stand here and tell you that in my relatively short academic career, I've never really come across problems within the auspices of research in terms of welfare. I haven't seen bad practice or something that would say alert me. However, a couple of months ago, I was handling a paper as an editor, and it was quite a nice paper. It was on wild animals, it was conducted abroad. People described what they were doing with their wild animals in a very nice, generic fashion. Even at the end, confirmed they'd have complied with various bits of guidance, such as ASAP's guidance, ABS guidance. However, I was alerted to a problem by a friend who was acting as a referee, and he had refereed this paper for another journal, and it had been rejected from that journal on ethical grounds. And he alerted to me what actually had done, and as it turned out, they had done things which were perfectly legal within the country, but they'd kind of tried to subvert it. They were very dishonest in the way they presented the facts about their research in that scientific paper. They had essentially just tried to cover it up and suggested they were doing things that they weren't. And I'm very pleased to say that the journal at that point took a very strong stance. Even though it was a good paper with very good reviews, they took a firm stance that from an ethical standpoint, it had to be rejected. And that is probably the first real case in my academic career where I've come across members of the scientific community trying to kind of be dishonest in the way they're presenting things, trying to present things in a much more positive light than they actually were. That's a bit of a negative. What I'm going to be talking about today is really about the challenges of animal research. I want to please note that in my title I'm not using the word science here, because the case I'm going to make is that animal research, that research is done in a really, really broad fashion. It's not just done by scientists, it's done by the general public, it's done by volunteers, it's done by people who are not necessarily of scientific training. So research is a great big auspice that captures a lot of different potential interactions with wildlife. To put this in context, about 14 months ago, my colleague, Professor Lisa Collins, and myself were, I'd like to say, having a discussion. I think it was more of a heated argument actually over coffee. And we were making this point about how well wild animal weapons were treated within the scientific community. Were people perhaps publishing their research in clear fashions? Could we actually make accurate judgments about the welfare of the animals that were being used as part of that research? My argument was that, no, it really wasn't. Her argument was that perhaps we need to look into it. And I think out of this, we actually decided to come up with a practical methodological paper, which we'll be submitting probably in about another 6 months or so to Journal of Animal Ecology, whereby we're bringing together a how-to for wild animal research. This is both to draw together issues, concerns, highlight their problems, but also to provide guidance and best practice. So within this is to include examples of case studies that may revolve around, for example, legislation, where people might need to go and look at relevant legislation, how to consider decision matrices regarding release, or perhaps relatively difficult topics like euthanasia. And one of the key things we're trying to have in this is clarity. Clarity in terms of terminology, clarity in terms of process. As I say, we're about 40% of the way through this. It's something that will be coming out in the future. And as I say, this is kind of encapsulating where we've got. What I'm trying to present you today is very much about why it's difficult, why animal welfare research is difficult, but also where there are opportunities to improve, and certainly key considerations you might take away from this. So first I want to define what is wild animal welfare research. And I noticed in Angus's talk he changed from wild animals to wildlife. I think one of the key problems here is that wild animal research is exceptionally broad. I like to think of wild animal research as anything which is some form of data gathering of wild animals. That may be wild animals in captivity, it may be just simple observations of birds in your garden, which are then submitted to the RSPB, for example. That's a form of data gathering. And I want to draw that distinction from perhaps people who are going to view wildlife just for simple pleasure, ecotourism, bird watching, bird spotting, things like that. So, in this context, wild animal research is straightaway very broad because it includes processes that we haven't considered as research. The Great British Garden Bird Watch, for example, is a data gathering exercise. That is, technically speaking, wild animal research. How significant is it? I focused here in the UK, but these numbers can also be scaled up. So I went to the Home Office recently and had a look at how many animals were being used under their Animal Licensing Act. And there were 2 million procedures. That's 2 million procedures of wild-type animals, so rats, mice, and things. They weren't GM modified. There was another couple of million animals used that were genetically modified. Of those 2 million procedures, that does include some true wild animals within that. So that might be some wild birds, for example, blood sample, or fish, for example, that had implanted transmitters. Those would fall within this. I did notice in this breakdown, and I had to look through all the lovely Excel spreadsheets, actually I couldn't find a number. I couldn't tell you within what is licensed under the Home Office how many wild animals are actually being used. It was all very, 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 very opaque in this context. I'd like to think the number is quite small, and I imagine it is relatively small compared to lab animal research, but I can't put a number on it. I can't tell you if we're talking 5,000 procedures, or 10,000 procedures, or even potentially 100,000 procedures. There's no definitive number there. Of things that we do know, for example, BTO under license, between 800,000 and 1 million birds are ringed annually under the BTO ringing scheme. That's all data that's submitted to the BTO. It's all data that's used as part of wild animal research. That could be tracking migratory patterns or physiological patterns or whatever. It's still, technically speaking, wild animal research. And if we scale this up to the RSPB Big Garden Bird Watch, there were 8 million birds being observed in 2015 Big Garden Bird Watch. So actually speaking, at the very low end, relatively non-intrusive, wild animal research is really, really quite large, very large, broad scale. Big numbers. And moving on to severity. So within the Home Office licensing, procedures are categorised in a degree of severity. Minor, lower end, very minor procedures, through to major procedures. Now, most wildlife research is either sub-threshold, so it doesn't require a Home Office license. Things like bird ringing, for example, would not be a procedure under the Home Office license. But things like blood sampling or anything that requires an anaesthesia, for example, would fall within that context as being a licensed procedure. Now, again, there is no breakdown. I can't tell you how many procedures would fit within, say, the major or the moderate or severe categories. I'd like to think, naively, most of these procedures that are being carried out are relatively minor. Their purposes of taking blood samples, that might be for monitoring diseases or monitoring physiology. They should, in theory, or hopefully, all be at the relatively low end in terms of severity categories. Now, one thing that we don't necessarily do very well in wild animal research is consider the cumulative impacts, particularly long-term cumulative impacts. This was a nice study they did in bears in America, and they looked at, in this case, the repeated trapping of bears across their lifetime. And you can see that individuals that were caught just once had, in comparison to those caught multiple times in this case, 3 or even 5 times, significant differences in physiology. This was a long-term impact of being repeatedly captured. This is not relatively invasive stuff. It's maybe just an anesthetic, or maybe it was even just captured. But the cumulative impact over time was quite severe. And similarly, there was a study that came out quite recently to do with bird ringing that showed that birds that were caught repeatedly in relatively short space of time were having a very negative impact on return to their territories, negative return to their singing posts, and actually were having a negative impact on their reproduction subsequently. And that's a process that I think for a lot of people probably wouldn't give much thought in terms of the cumulative impact. So although there are clear definitions within the Home Office licence of the severity of procedures, we must be very, very mindful of considering what are the cumulative impacts of the research we do. Now, I want to move on to why wild animal research is challenging. I think because it's such an amorphous, very polymorphic type of discipline. Research can be conducted in pretty much any kind of fashion. It may be for purposes, for example, for monitoring disease, bovine TB, taking blood samples. It may be for purposes of basic applied research, home raisins, understanding the very nature and the biology of that species, or for a conservation perspective. It may involve long-term modeling, for example, looking at changes in population over time, or changes in migratory patterns over time. So there's a long-term element. And then, I guess in a smaller proportion of cases, we've got ecological manipulations, whereby there may be some kind of change to the environment. That might be the removal of individuals, it might be the addition of individuals, it may be the changing of food density or something. Incredibly diverse, all asking very interesting questions. But at the same time, do we necessarily understand the impacts of all these different types of research on the wild animal welfare? I'm not saying I have an answer, by the way, for this. I'm just saying that it's very complex and we should be mindful that it may have very, very differing impacts. Wild animal research is also conducting a real diversity of areas and habitats and locations around the world. I work in black grouse in Scandinavia, and when I do my trapping in the field season, it can sometimes drop down to -40. It's pretty chilly. It's chilly for the researchers doing it, it's chilly for the birds. We have to be very, very, very mindful that the temperature, the environment we're working in, is itself posing a threat to those animals we're working on. Similarly, you can work in desert climates. You can work in environments where it's hot, it's humid. The conditions, the environmental conditions the animals live in are exceptionally diverse, and we must be very careful to think about how our studies, our strategies to keep welfare at a high standard are impacted by those environmental conditions. And again, there's no one size fits all. And there's a diversity of species. I did notice in all the previous talks that there was a real strong bias here to cuddly, fluffy animals. If you want to know, there were 18 pictures of mammals, there were only 3 of birds, and there were 2 dead fishes. Kind of suggesting a slight bias. When we think of wild animal welfare, we're generally thinking of sort of higher sentient animals. We're thinking of higher vertebrates, mammals, and birds and things. I'd like to put this to you that actually wild animal welfare really should be encapsulating all animals. It should be including animals, including invertebrates. We have to be mindful that maybe they don't have a high level of sentience, but our impacts on the wider population could be significant. If you put some moth traps out, potentially you could be really significantly perturbing that local moth population by drawing them in, potentially harming them. Similarly, other techniques as well involve kill trapping, pitfall sampling as well, has a real potential to have a negative impact on the wider population, not just the individuals. You're probably wondering why I put all these species up here on the PowerPoint. And these are just wild animals I picked that we work on within my local department. Everything from captive reptiles, things such as cognition, through to immunology, parental care of bearing beetles, through to things like cetacean, birds, and lizards, etc., actually working in the field. So again, wild animal research is very complex because it is so incredibly diverse. The nature of the species is incredibly broad. And we're often dealing with a real diversity of techniques, and it'd be very easy for me to stand here and straight away point to the photographs here of the tail flukes of the whales and say, here's an example of a low impact method of collecting some data, but it isn't necessarily always the case. There's been quite a few studies recently that have shown that methods that we might consider relatively inintrusive or have low impact have a whole series of unintended harms. I'm going to give you an example later on which came out quite recently. So we've got to be careful that we don't necessarily make some blanket assumptions that what we're doing in terms of techniques, whether it's radio calling, radio tracking, or tagging, or even just taking photographs, being there in the local environment, all of these things can have some kind of unintended harm. We'll be very careful in terms of monitoring them. And we shouldn't forget that actually working with wild animals itself can be quite dangerous for the people themselves. If you're working in cold climates or environments which are dangerous to the animal, they're probably also quite dangerous to you. As I say, I work at minus 40 degrees. I guess one of the primary things I'm worried about is if I happen to crash into a snowdrift, who's going to come and find me and help dig me out? There's a potential for hypothermia. Similarly for the animals I'm working with, but for myself, I have to be very cautious and mindful that it is dangerous. And certainly people work with dangerous species, and wild animal researchers do, unfortunately, sometimes get killed by their study animals. As I've already said at the beginning, wild animal research is not just our scientists, it's a range of different people out there doing wild animal research. Some, for example, if you're doing bird ringing, there's a training procedure that the PTO have in place so that you are skilled enough to do it. But there are research that can be done by people who don't necessarily have the necessary skills. People could go out into their local environment and perhaps cause more harm than they intended, unintentionally, I might stress, then we come back to intent. But the point is that people may not necessarily have the skills that they think they have and carry out something that has an impact. It may be wildlife practitioners, it may be people. All these are different, these people have different skill levels that may therefore be impacting the welfare of the animals they're working with. We're not all highly trained specialists. Now, I think one of the things that is difficult about wild animals is how do we define a wild animal or wildlife in another way. Now, under the Home Office license, under ASFA, wild animals are defined as one that's never been cared for or farmed by humans. And I think it's very useful that this legislation that has come out recently during the summer in July actually is starting to define some of these terms. If you go to other countries, you go to Australia, to Canada, they've got slightly different definitions. For example, wild animals will include those that are captive bred, for example. So wild animals in zoos will be included in that. Animals in rehabilitation centres are included within that of wild animal. In the UK as well, in terms of wild animals, they're talking about animals from cephalopods up into the vertebrates. So they're not interested in non-vertebrates, not interested in decapods into crustaceans, not interested in insects in that context. Wild animals is a very loaded term. It means something very, very different from perhaps what I would suggest. It should mean perhaps all animals. And I do know that in the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the term wild animals is used again very generally, and under the list of animals included there, it does include non-vertebrates. So even within our own legislation, the term wild animals is used quite differently in different pieces of legislation. And certainly, a key part here is actually bringing some kind of unity, bringing some kind of consistency to legislation about how terms are actually applied. So what is regulated? What is a procedure? So in the UK, under the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, certain procedures require a Home Office license. And in the case of wildlife, we're talking about techniques that may cause some sort of pain. Hot and freeze or chemical branding, for example. Conventional tattooing, we're talking about here rather than just a single tattooing bleb, more complex, or a number, for example, would fall under this. Microchipping in terms of pit tagging is not included, except for the pit tags themselves exceed a certain size relative to that species size. So there's a bit of grey area there. Pit tagging with a very small pit tag would be perfectly allowed without a Home Office license, whereas if it falls of a certain size relative to the animal size, it is actually got a Home Office license. Similarly, it's also from the skilled insertion of a hypodermic needle, so including blood sampling, for example, requires a Home Office license. But it does mean that there's a whole bunch of wild animal research that doesn't require any form of regulation. There are forms of observation and there are forms of capture that aren't yet regulated. And these are certainly areas where perhaps there's a challenge to maintain our wild animal welfare standards. There's also a question about when animals leave this protection afforded by the Act. As it's defined, it's when there's no need for any further data collection, or in this case, data collection or observations. Well, that can be really challenging. The reason I put these animals up here is because I've had friends and colleagues who've worked on these kind of animals. And at some point, their data collection is finished, they've got some radio transmitters out on these animals. They haven't got any chance whatsoever to get those radio transmitters off. They cannot, technically speaking, finish with their work. The animals are free roaming, they're too difficult to catch, they'll probably never see them again. So with wild animal research, it's quite a challenge. Where is that endpoint? When can we say that the animal is completely free from our control or influence? If they're still carrying a transmitter or potentially a mark, it is still linked to us, it's still got some kind of influence, some still key, something that we need to be considering. So is there a problem? I like some questions here. Now, I have heard from a colleague, and this wasn't actually within the context of wild animal research, it was in the context of lab animal research. In some cases, people were moving their research abroad to make use of lower regulatory thresholds. In some countries, with actually no regulatory thresholds. That's exceptionally dishonest, and if they were found out, that's when it comes to publishing, and they should be suitably punished. I personally, from my experience, don't know anybody who has made use of other countries around the world with lower regulatory standards to carry out their wild animal research, but I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I was asked actually by Peter, there's been concern about whether there is wild animal research that's regulated, that's being carried out without a license. There may be. It's a simple answer. I don't know from personal experience, I can't think of any, but again, it might be. It's incredibly difficult to police. As I say, going back to the paper I was asked to handle as an editor, I would have had no problems in terms of ethics with that paper unless I'd been alerted by that nice reviewer. The way the paper was written, the way it was explained, was all very clear, was all very, very within what I would consider to be good animal welfare. So policing these things in particular are exceptionally difficult. And the last thing I think is probably a clear yes. Do we fully understand the potential outcomes of what we do? Well, no, actually we don't. Yes, we should, but no, we don't have a full grasp of it. Science moves on. We have new techniques. We are constantly introducing new ideas, new non-invasive techniques. Do we actually understand whether it has an impact? Now, it's been mentioned about the 3 R's previously, and I want to highlight here that there can be a conflict in terms of the 3 R's with wild animal research. In terms of replacement, it may be that our study animals of conservation interest, or we're interested in gathering basic biology about a single species. There may be one alternative. That doesn't mean the research shouldn't look at it, but often that might be quite difficult to do. In terms of refinement, I think wild animal research has been quite good at driving forward different ways of collecting samples that don't necessarily need invasive techniques, perhaps are trying to minimise potential harm. So I think wild animal research does that quite well. But reduction, I have a real problem with the term reduction. If we think about reducing our sample sizes, that could be a real challenge in wild animal research. They live in natural environments incredibly complex, the environmental work, the economic conditions are challenging, they're genetically more diverse than wild animal populations. These often mean that we actually inherently need larger sample sizes to actually be able to find the effects and to actually be able to study the animals and provide some scientific answers. So reduction, if you apply that blankly, is actually a conflict there. That forced reduction of sample sizes may actually mean ultimately we don't find successful outcomes to our research. Animals may therefore be wasted if we're forced to reduce our sample sizes too much. It's a good principle, but we've got to be very careful we don't push it too far within the context of 3Rs. As I said, do we know if we're causing sort of harm? Any form of intervention with an animal is going to cause some kind of harm. Being present in an animal's local environment has an impact, whether it knows you're there or not. It may be the sound of the motor vehicle that you've got there. The recent study in America showed that bears were aware and being stressed by the presence of drones flying overhead that were being used to monitor them. Well, there was a nice example of a technique. You think, I don't have to go up close to those bears, I don't have to interact with them. But it's been shown that those bears are being stressed by this new technique. So we must be very mindful to consider that all research at some point may have the potential to cause harm. And that applies, as I say, to intrusive or non-intrusive studies. And actually we must as researchers, who are carrying out research, you must take a step back and try and consider what the harm might be. And if possible, try and see if you can actually gather some data on it. Test it. Is it possible that your research methods are actually harmful? And this kind of level of harm should feed into a cost-benefit analysis. Clearly, if the research you're carrying out is too harmful for that species, if the benefits are being far outweighed by the cost, you shouldn't be doing that study. You should be avoiding it completely. I personally don't think that these kind of decisions are made enough in the context of wild animal research. As part of the review we've been conducting, we've been going through the Journal of Animal Ecology, we've been going through every single paper for the last 10 years. It is absolutely mind-numbing work. But we've been going through and trying to assess the clarity of the information they're providing within their papers, both in terms of the animals, procedures, sample sizes, harm, cost-benefit analysis. And what we're finding is, even in a well-respected journal, that the amount of papers that actually do this are surprisingly small. So certainly, although we haven't come to the conclusions of our review yet, is that we're going to stress that it's much more, it's going to be fundamental in the future that studies consider the cost-benefit of the research they're doing, and at least provide some evidence of this cost-benefit. So to finish, because I'm sure tummy's all rumbling for lunch, I'd just like to stress that wild animal research is exceptionally complex. It's made challenging by the diversity of the locations, the species, the methods involved, by the nature of the people who are actually carrying it out. Within that, we need a greater clarity of key definitions, particularly defining what is a wild animal, and defining key issues. Because if we don't have clarity within the scientific literature, within the legislation, it makes it harder to police, and it makes it harder to monitor what actually might happen. And at the same time, we must have, in terms of science, a greater understanding, a greater appreciation of the kind of impacts our research techniques might be having. Even if we think we may, on the face of it, not be causing harm, we do need to investigate to make sure we actually are not causing that harm. We don't want to be causing negative impacts on populations, potentially causing extinctions or local extinctions of that species. We want to be making sure that what we're doing is at the highest possible standard that we can. And I'd just like to thank my co-authors, there's many of them, Matt Brash sitting here in the audience, Pete Goller for inviting me, and also the Journal of Animal Ecology editors who've encouraged us to put together this rather monumental review for their journal. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Hi, thank you, Steve Wilkins, U4. Just a quick one to do with the ethical status of papers coming in. Clearly, depending on which country you're doing the research in, you're going to be operating under different legislation. So, if you're operating in the base of the country where that's the standard, you're submitting it to a paper that's in the European journal, which standard then are you recommending the researcher follows? Because they can quite easily argue that they've done everything that they need to do in their country and they're following their legislation. So are you saying that you should always adhere to the higher standard, which clearly from a welfare perspective is fantastic, but given all the diversity globally, is clearly very problematic indeed, particularly where also these wild species are based in the study.
Okay, very interesting question. One of the first steps has to be that in the reporting of any science that we need greater clarity. For example, the ARRIVE guidelines are for in vivo research, and they're applied in many sort of biomedical journals, for example, applying a similar sort of standard set of guidance and reporting of the wild animal research in a similar sort of clear fashion would allow a greater examination of what is being done and where. Now, I appreciate that there is different legislation covering different countries, but at the same time, journal editors shouldn't be afraid of applying a high level of standard when they see a paper coming in, if they can judge it, for example, and rejecting manuscripts that fall outside what they would consider their ethical boundaries. Going back to the paper which I rejected, what they carried out was perfectly legal within the country they did it. And in terms of a welfare point of view, and on a legislative point of view, there was no grounds for refusing it. But the fact is they were trying to subvert it, they were trying to hide what they did, they were even citing the ABS guidelines, the ASAP guidelines as being complied with. That was actually more of a justification for rejecting it. But I think, as I say, our first step has to be clarity of reporting. If that has to be a standalone sheet that's submitted alongside papers, I think that would be fantastic.
Great, thanks Carl. Thanks for the interesting question, Steve. There are lots of sort of angles on that, but let's thank Carl once again.